You know, I've always found that the people who scream the loudest about rules are usually the ones who benefit the most from them being selectively enforced. I once met a woman who tried to have me arrested for digging a hole on my own property. By the time I was done with her, she and her husband had to sell off their prize-winning cattle, and she was voted out of the very position she used to terrorize me. This story is a bit of a wild ride, so buckle up, and hey, while you're settling in, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. It all started because I finally achieved a lifelong dream: buying a proper ranch. Not a 10-acre hobby farm, but a real sprawling 300-acre slice of heaven with rolling hills, a creek, and enough space to forget the rest of the world existed. I'm a hydrogeologist by trade. That's a fancy way of saying I'm a water doctor for the earth. I spend my days studying groundwater, how it moves, its quality, and how to manage it sustainably. After 2 decades of consulting for big agricultural firms and municipalities, I'd saved up enough to buy the kind of land I'd only ever analyzed on paper. The property was the remnant of a much larger historic ranch that had been in the same family for a century. About 15 years ago, the family sold off a prime 50-acre parcel to a developer who put in a high-end of Dissery and two gated community called Crestview Estates. It was one of those places with oversized houses on undersized lots, a community pool, and an HOA with a rulebook thicker than a phone book. My 300 acres wrapped around this community on 3 sides, a tranquil sea of green surrounding their little island of beige stucco. The best part? I wasn't part of their HOA. My land was independent, a sovereign nation of one, or so I thought. The first few months were pure bliss. I spent my time repairing old fences, clearing brush, and just walking the land, getting to know its contours and secrets. The original ranch house was old but solid, and it came with a well that provided more than enough water for my domestic needs. My plan was to eventually run a small, sustainable herd of my own, nothing major, just enough to make the land productive. But to do that, I'd need a separate, high-yield agricultural well. It was a standard procedure for any rural property owner, and given my profession, I knew exactly what was required, from the geological survey to the county permits. I wasn't just following the rules. I literally wrote the book on them for some of my clients. My first interaction with the HOA president, a woman named Brenda, was as unpleasant as it was predictable. I was out on my ATV, checking a fence line that bordered her backyard, one of the largest lots in Crestview, naturally. She came marching out of her house, a portable speaker blasting some generic pop music from her meticulously manicured patio. Brenda was a woman who looked permanently wound up, dressed in expensive athletic wear that had clearly never seen a bead of sweat. She was holding a gold-colored tumbler that probably cost more than my work boots. "Excuse me," she yelled over the music, pointing a finger at me. "That is the Crestview Estates community perimeter. You're not allowed to operate motorized vehicles that close to our residences. It's a noise violation." I killed the engine on the ATV. The sudden silence was punctuated by the chirping of birds she'd just been drowning out. "Ma'am, this is my property," I said, pointing to the rusted barbed wire fence between us. "My fence line is about 5 feet on my side of this old wire. I'm well within my own land." She squinted, her face tightening. The HOA covenants state a 50-foot noise buffer from the perimeter fence. We paid for privacy and tranquility. It was a masterclass in entitlement. She was trying to enforce her private club's rules on a non-member, on his own land. "With all due respect," I said, trying to keep the sarcasm from dripping out, "your HOA's rules stop right there at that fence. This is my ranch. I can ride my ATV, my tractor, or a solid gold chariot pulled by unicorns anywhere I please on this side of the wire. But I'm a reasonable guy. I'll try to keep the noise down when I'm near your homes." I thought that was a fair compromise. I was wrong. It was like a declaration of war. "We'll see about that," she sniffed, turning on her heel and marching back to her palace of beige. I saw her husband, a man named Don, peering out the window. He looked like a guy who had lost an argument every day for the last 20 years. A week later, I got a formal-looking letter in the mail. It was from the Crestview Estates HOA Architectural Review Committee, informing me that the color of my Barna Classic Traditional red was not on their approved palette of earth tones and would need to be repainted immediately to avoid fines. I laughed out loud. The barn was half a mile from their nearest house and was built 80 years before their HOA was even a fever dream in a developer's mind. I tossed the letter in the trash. This was the level of absurdity I was dealing with. Brenda was the queen of a tiny, self-important kingdom, and she viewed my ranch as a vassal state that needed to be brought to heel. It was this initial, ridiculous overreach that made me realize any major project I undertook would be met with maximum resistance. When I decided to move forward with drilling the new agricultural well, I knew I was in for a fight. I just had no idea how big that fight would become, or that the ground beneath our feet held a secret that would give me the power to dismantle her entire empire. The first step was simple: file the paperwork. I submitted my geological survey, my proposed well design, and the application for a drilling permit to the county. Everything was by the book, meticulously detailed. The county approved it in less than 2 weeks. The day the drilling rig was scheduled to arrive, I felt a sense of excitement. I was improving my land, making it more valuable and functional. It was a good day. I wasn't naive. I expected Brenda to make a fuss. I figured she'd send more stupid letters, maybe try to organize a petition. I vastly underestimated her capacity for unhinged escalation. The drilling rig, a massive truck-mounted affair, rumbled up my long driveway early on a Tuesday morning. The crew, a couple of seasoned good old boys I'd known professionally for years, got to work setting up. The location I'd chosen was a good quarter-mile from the HOA, deliberately so. It was the optimal spot geologically, and I hoped the distance would provide a buffer from Brenda's inevitable wrath. It didn't. Within an hour, a pristine white Lexus SUV came crunching up my gravel drive, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. It parked haphazardly, blocking one of the support trucks. Brenda emerged, this time clad in what I can only describe as a safari chic ensemble, complete with a ridiculous linen sun hat. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing at the rig as if it were a crashed UFO. "You are conducting a major industrial operation here. The noise, the dust, this is completely unacceptable." One of the drillers, a big guy named Hank, just looked at me and slowly shook his head. I walked over to her, keeping my voice calm and even. "Brenda, we've been over this. This is my property. I have a legally issued permit from the county to drill a water well. We are in full compliance with all regulations." I held up a plastic-sleeved copy of the permit. She didn't even glance at it. Her eyes were fixed on the rig, her face a mask of outrage. A permit? I was not consulted. The Crestview Estates HOA was not notified. "You are jeopardizing our community's water supply. Our own wells could run dry because of your recklessness." There it was, the first mention of the water supply. It was a baseless claim, of course. My hydrogeological survey showed that the aquifer we were tapping was vast and robust. A single new well would have a negligible impact, a fact the county's own experts had confirmed when they approved my permit. "Brenda, that's not how groundwater works," I started to explain, my professional instincts kicking in. "The aquifer is extensive, and my withdrawal rates are well within the sustainable yield." She cut me off, holding up a hand. "Save your pseudo-scientific jargon. I am the president of the HOA, and I am responsible for the welfare of over 100 families. My husband, Don, is on the board of the Regional Cattlemen's Association. We understand resource management." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Her husband's resource management involved a small, pampered herd of about 30 boutique longhorn cattle on a 15-acre plot adjacent to the HOA, which was more of a status symbol than a real agricultural operation. They mostly just stood around looking picturesque for his Instagram page. The amount of water they must have been going through just to keep his vanity pasture green was probably more than my new well would use in a year. "Your responsibility ends at your property line," I said, my patience wearing thin. "This operation is legal, permitted, and safe. Now, if you'll excuse us, these gentlemen are on the clock." I turned to walk away. "That was a mistake. I am warning you," she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made the birds scatter. "Shut this down right now, or you will face the consequences." I just gave her a little wave over my shoulder and told Hank to proceed. The roar of the diesel engine starting up was my definitive answer. I watched in my rearview mirror as she stood there, fuming, before finally peeling out in her Lexus. I knew it wasn't over, but I never imagined her next move would involve law enforcement. The drilling went on for 2 days. It's a loud, messy process, but the crew was professional. They laid down protective matting to minimize damage to the pasture and set up silt fences to control runoff. On the 3rd day, they were getting ready to case the well. It was the final, crucial step, and that's when 2 county sheriff's department vehicles rolled up my driveway, lights flashing. My heart jumped into my throat. Even when you know you've done nothing wrong, the sight of flashing lights on your own property is deeply unsettling. 2 deputies got out, looking decidedly unimpressed with the situation. The senior deputy, a man with a tired face and a name tag that read Miller, walked over to me. "Sir, are you the property owner?" he asked. I confirmed that I was. "We received a call about some illegal activity," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the drilling rig. "Something about theft of county resources and an unpermitted commercial operation?" I felt a surge of anger, but I pushed it down. Getting angry at the cops is a fool's game. They're just the messengers. "Deputy, my name is protagonist's name," I said, handing him my driver's license. "I am a hydrogeologist. This is a permitted agricultural well-being drilled on my private property. Here is a copy of the permit from the county, my geological survey, and the drilling company's license and insurance." I handed him the neat folder I'd been keeping in my truck for this exact eventuality. Deputy Miller took the folder and began to read through it. His younger partner walked over to have a chat with Hank, who was leaning against the rig looking bored. Brenda, I realized, hadn't just made a noise complaint. She had accused me of stealing water. She'd framed a perfectly legal activity as a criminal enterprise. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Deputy Miller spent a few minutes looking everything over. He was thorough. He walked back to his car and I could see him talking on the radio, likely confirming the permit number with the county clerk's office. After about 10 minutes, he walked back over and handed me my folder. "Well, sir, everything appears to be perfectly in order," he said, with a hint of an apology in his voice. "We have to respond to every call, you understand." "I understand completely, Deputy," I replied. "Was the complainant by any chance a woman named Brenda from the Crestview Estates next door?" A weary sigh escaped him. "We can't disclose who makes a report, sir. But let's just say we are familiar with the address." His partner came back over, shaking his head with a slight smirk. "Hank here tells me you guys are about to hit the Edwards Aquifer. Good water down there." "That's the plan," I said. Miller nodded. "All right, sir. Sorry to have bothered you. You all have a good day." They got back in their cars and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and an awkward silence. Hank looked at me. "She really called the cops on you for drilling a well on your own ranch?" "She did, Hank. She did." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Some people got more money than sense." The incident solidified 2 things in my mind. First, Brenda was not just a petty tyrant. She was genuinely malicious and willing to use serious public resources to harass me. Second, her obsession with my well and her baseless claim that it would drain the HOA's water was the key. She had handed me the very weapon I would need. She thought the fight was about noise and dust and aesthetics. I realized it was about water. And in that arena, on this specific piece of land, I was the expert, and she was a rank amateur who had no idea what was lurking in the fine print of her own community's history. My initial annoyance was transforming into a cold, methodical resolve. She wanted a war over water rights? Fine. I would give her one. But I wouldn't be fighting on her terms. I'd be fighting on mine, with facts, history, and the full, unyielding weight of the law. I decided right then and there to stop reacting to her attacks and to start my own offensive. It was time to go to the county records office and pull every single deed, plat map, and water rights filing connected to the original ranch and the Crestview Estates subdivision. Somewhere in that mountain of paper, I was sure I'd find the truth. The day after the sheriff's visit was quiet, too quiet. I knew Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Being proven wrong by the deputies wouldn't chasten her, it would enrage her. She would see it as a failure of the system to recognize her inherent authority, and she would simply escalate to a higher power. I was right. A week later, a certified letter arrived. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was from a law firm in the city, the kind with a fancy address and a logo featuring a scale of justice. The letter was a formal notice of a pending legal challenge. Brenda, in her official capacity as HOA president, had filed a petition with the County Water Management Board to place an emergency injunction on my well. The petition claimed my well posed an imminent and catastrophic threat to the water supply of the Crestview Estates, citing potential damage to property values and the delicate environmental balance of the area. It was filled with dramatic, unsubstantiated language, clearly drafted to be as alarming as possible. They were demanding the county not only halt my current operations, but permanently revoke my permit. This was a serious escalation. Calling the cops was harassment. This was a formal legal assault. While I knew their claims were hydrogeologically baseless, a board of county commissioners might be swayed by a group of wealthy, vocal homeowners, regardless of the science. This could get expensive and time-consuming, which was likely her goal, to bleed me dry with legal fees until I gave up. But Brenda had made a critical miscalculation. She assumed I was just some guy who bought a ranch. She didn't know that my entire career was built on navigating exactly these kinds of disputes. She was challenging a fish to a swimming contest. A grim smile spread across my face. This wasn't a nuisance anymore. This was a professional challenge. I grabbed my keys and drove into town, not to my own lawyer yet, but to the county courthouse. The records archive is in the basement, a place that smells of old paper and forgotten stories. Most people find it intimidating, but to me, it's a treasure trove. I spent the entire afternoon pulling plat maps, surveying records, and, most importantly, the original deed of subdivision for Crestview Estates. I spread the massive, crinkling documents out on a large table. There was the original parcel, a huge, sprawling 350-acre tract belonging to the old ranching family, the McAllisters. And there, carved out of it, was the 50-acre rectangle that became Crestview. I traced the lines with my finger, cross-referencing the surveyor's notes. I found the section on utilities and easements. As expected, the developer had drilled 2 community wells to service the new homes. The deed granted each lot in Crestview an easement for access to and use of water from the shared community well system. Standard stuff, but then I noticed something strange. Or rather, I noticed the absence of something. When a large property with established water rights is subdivided, there is supposed to be a formal severance and transfer of those rights. The original 350-acre ranch would have had a primary water rights claim, likely dating back decadessa senior right, that gives it priority. The developer should have formally severed a portion of those rights and transferred them to the new entity, the HOA. But there was no record of it, no severance clause, no separate water rights deed. The developer had granted the new homeowners access to the water, but it appeared he had failed to grant them legal ownership of it. The primary water rights, it seemed, had remained with the parent parcel. The unsold, 300-acre remainder of the McAllister Ranch, the ranch I now owned. My heart started beating faster. This was a rookie mistake, a massive oversight by the developer's lawyers 15 years ago. It was the kind of detail that goes unnoticed as long as nobody makes a fuss. Everyone just assumes the water they're using is legally theirs. For 15 years, the Crestview HOA had been operating under a gigantic, false assumption. They were like tenants in an apartment who thought they owned the building. But I needed to be sure. This was too big to be based on a hunch. I needed to find someone who remembered the original deal. That led me to Earl. Earl was a local legend. He was in his late 70s, lived on a small plot of land a few miles down the road, and had worked as a foreman on the McAllister Ranch for 40 years before the family sold up. He knew every fence post, every creek bed, and every bit of local history. I found him on his porch, repairing a saddle. He was weathered and wiry, with eyes that had seen it all. I introduced myself, told him I was the new owner of the old ranch, and he immediately warmed up. "Heard someone finally bought it who plans to work it, not just stare at it," he said, offering me a glass of iced tea. I asked him about the sale to the developer 15 years ago. Earl snorted. "Oh, I remember that. Slick fella from the city. Paid old man McAllister a fortune for that piece. McAllister was happy to get it. His kids didn't want the ranch, and he was ready to retire. "Earl, I'm looking at the deeds," I said, "and I'm seeing something funny about the water rights. Do you remember how that was handled?" He leaned back in his rocking chair, thinking. "Water. Yeah, the developer fella. He was always talking about water. He drilled those 2 big wells for his fancy houses." Old man McAllister told him, "You can use the water, but that water belongs to this ranch. It's on the deed going back to my grandpappy." The developer just kinda smiled and said, Yeah, of course, a handshake deal. We're all friends here." A handshake deal. My God. He never formally bought the water rights? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Earl shook his head. Nope. McAllister was proud of that. He figured if that fancy housing development ever went bust, the land would be useless to another rancher without the water rights, and he could buy it back for pennies on the dollar. He saw it as his insurance policy. He always said, "The land is worth nothing without the water, and the water is mine." There it was. The smoking gun wasn't just a missing clause in a document. It was a deliberate, strategic decision by the original owner. The entire Crestview Estates development, with its 100-plus homes, its community pool, and most importantly, Brenda and Don's water-guzzling boutique cattle farm, was dependent on a 15-year-old handshake deal that the current owner me knew nothing about and was not legally bound by. Brenda, in her arrogant crusade to shut down my single, legally permitted well, had forced me to uncover a truth that gave me control over her entire community's water supply. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Now I knew I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the best property and water rights attorney in the state. I thanked Earl for his time and the iced tea. As I was leaving, he called out, "Hey, that lady in the big white car from the new houses, she been bothering you?" You could say that, Earl. He grinned a slow, knowing grin. Old man McAllister would be laughing his head off right now. Give him hell, son. Oh, I planned to. Brenda had picked a fight thinking she held all the cards. She was about to find out she had been playing with an empty deck from the very beginning. My next stop was the office of Marcus Davies, Esquire. He was a semi-retired lawyer in his late 60s, with a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom and an absolute master of the arcane world of Texas water law. He operated out of a small, unassuming brick building on the town square, but his name carried weight all the way to the state capitol. When I laid out the deeds, the subdivision plat, my well permit, the HOA's injunction request, and told him the story Earl had shared, Marcus listened without interruption. Peering at the documents through a pair of half-moon glasses, he was silent for a long time after I finished, just tracing the property lines on the old map with his finger. Finally, he looked up at me, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Mr. Protagonist's name," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is the most gloriously stupid oversight by a developer I have ever seen in my 40-year career. They built a multi-million-dollar subdivision on a foundation of legal sand." He confirmed my suspicion. The original water rights, the senior rights connected to the original McAllister Ranch, were never severed. They were appurtenant to the land, meaning they stayed with the original property parcel unless explicitly and legally transferred. The HOA's claim was based on usage, not ownership. They had a prescriptive easement to use the water, but that was a weak position, especially since their use was permissive, based on a handshake deal with the prior owner. My deed, which conveyed the entirety of the remaining ranch, together with all rights and appurtenances, gave me the controlling interest. So, what does this mean, practically? I asked. "It means," Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair, "that you, my friend, are the water baron of Crestview Estates. Their 2 community wells are, legally speaking, pumping your water. You have every right to drill your own well. In fact, you could, if you were so inclined, send them a bill for the last 15 years of water usage. Or you could simply tell them to stop pumping. The sheer power of that position was staggering. I could literally turn off the water to the entire neighborhood. But that wasn't my goal. I wasn't a monster. The other homeowners in Crestview were innocent bystanders in Brenda's personal war. My target was Brenda and her abuse of power. We needed a strategy that would neutralize her, protect my rights, and create a fair and permanent solution for everyone else. This couldn't just be about winning. it had to be about winning correctly. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and I prepared for the Water Management Board hearing. It was a two-pronged approach. First, we would dismantle the HOA's petition with overwhelming scientific evidence. I prepared a detailed hydrogeological report, complete with 3D models of the aquifer, flow rate charts, and a peer-reviewed analysis showing that my new well's impact on their wells would be statistically insignificant, less than a 0.5% reduction in pressure, well within normal seasonal fluctuations. It was an unassailable mountain of data that made their imminent and catastrophic threat claim look utterly ridiculous. The second prong was the kill shot. We would wait for them to present their entire case. We would let Brenda, her lawyer, and her husband Don pontificate about their rights, their property values, and my supposed recklessness. Then, at the very end, Marcus would calmly present our findings on the actual ownership of the water rights. We wouldn't just be defending my well, we would be flipping the entire script. We weren't the defendants anymore, we were the aggrieved party. To make it even more effective, we drafted a document, a new water supply and easement agreement. It was a formal, legally binding contract that would replace the flimsy handshake deal. It would grant the Crestview HOA a permanent, deeded right to draw water from the aquifer on my property, securing their water supply forever. It would establish a fair maintenance fee for the shared resource, something they should have been paying all along. But it had one very special clause, which I personally requested. The agreement differentiated between residential and commercial water usage. Residential use would be charged at a very reasonable, fixed annual rate per household. Commercial use, however, would be metered and billed at the full market rate for agricultural water, which was significantly higher. The clause defined commercial use as any water used for the explicit purpose of raising livestock for sale or for irrigating pasture land greater than 1 acre. It was a clause aimed directly and exclusively at one single property in the entire subdivision, the home of Brenda and Don, and their boutique Longhorn cattle farm. Their vanity project, which I estimated used 10 times more water than any other home to keep their pasture lush and their 30 animals hydrated, would either become astronomically expensive or would have to be shut down. I was using Brenda's own tactics against her. She claimed to be protecting the community's resources. My agreement did exactly that, by making the single largest user pay their fair share. It was elegant. It was vicious. And it was perfectly, undeniably legal. Marcus loved it. He called it the surgical strike. The day of the hearing arrived. The county boardroom was packed. Brenda had rallied a dozen or so Crestview residents who sat behind her looking concerned. She was in her power suit, whispering instructions to her lawyer. Her husband Don sat beside her, looking puffed up and important. They looked confident, like they had already won. They had no idea they were walking into a perfectly laid trap. I sat with Marcus at the opposing table, with nothing but a single, slim briefcase between us. I caught Brenda's eye across the room. She gave me a look of pure contempt, a smug little smirk that said, "You're finished." I just smiled back, a calm, patient smile. The show was about to begin. She thought she was the director, but she was just an actress who hadn't read the final scene of the script. And in that scene, the quiet rancher she'd tried to crush was about to become her landlord. The hearing began with the chairman of the Water Management Board, a stern-looking man named Henderson, calling the meeting to order. The HOA's lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, stood up and began his presentation. He painted a picture of a peaceful, environmentally conscious community being threatened by an irresponsible outsider. He used words like fragile ecosystem, unregulated development, and potential for irreparable harm. He called Don, Brenda's husband, to testify. Don stood up and, in a self-important tone, spoke about his family's long-standing, all of 5 years, commitment to gentleman ranching and how my well could deplete the water table. Threatening his prize-winning longhorns, he spoke of the community's deep investment and the sanctity of their property values. It was all emotion and speculation, completely devoid of facts, but it was delivered with an air of authority that clearly resonated with the residents he'd brought along. Then, Brenda took the floor. This was her moment, her grand performance. She spoke with a practiced, trembling voice about her sleepless nights worrying about the children of the community, about the potential for their taps to run dry. She portrayed herself as a humble servant of the people, a lone protector standing against unchecked greed. "This isn't just about one well," she declared, her voice rising dramatically. "It is about precedent. If we allow this, what comes next? Will our quiet way of life be destroyed by industrial operations on our very doorstep? We implore this board to act, to protect our homes, our families, our future." She sat down to a smattering of applause from her supporters. She shot me a triumphant glare. Her lawyer rested their case, looking supremely confident. Chairman Henderson turned to us. "Mr. Davies, your response?" Marcus rose slowly, a stark contrast to the slick energy of the other lawyer. He walked to the podium with a calm, deliberate pace. "Mr. Chairman, members of the board," he began, his voice filling the room. "My client, Mr. Protagonist's name, is a hydrogeologist with 20 years of experience in water resource management. The claims made by the Crestview HOA are, to put it politely, fanciful." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus, using the report I had prepared, systematically dismantled their entire argument with a tidal wave of facts. He presented the 3D aquifer models, the flow rate data, the county's own independent analysis. He demonstrated that the HOA's 2 wells and my 1 well were drawing from an aquifer so large it could support a small city without issue. He showed that the imminent threat was a scientific impossibility. With each chart he displayed on the overhead projector, I could see the confidence draining from the faces of the HOA's lawyer and the board members. Brenda's supporters started whispering amongst themselves. When Marcus finished his scientific rebuttal, the HOA's case was in tatters. They looked foolish, but he wasn't done, however. Marcus continued, his tone shifting from academic to deadly serious. "This petition has forced my client to conduct a thorough review of the legal history of the properties in question. And in doing so, we have made a rather startling discovery." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "The Crestview HOA's petition to halt my client's well is based on the premise that they have a right to the water they are using. They have come before this board demanding you protect their water. But the inconvenient truth, Mr. Chairman, is that the water is not, and has never been, legally theirs." A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. That is an outrageous and unsubstantiated accusation." Chairman Henderson looked at Marcus. "Counselor, you'd better be able to back that up." "Oh, I can," Marcus said calmly. He pulled a thick, bound document from his briefcase, a certified copy of the original deed for the McAllister Ranch and the subsequent subdivision deed for Crestview Estates. "As this board knows, senior water rights in this state are appurtenant to the land. When the developer created the Crestview subdivision, he granted the new homeowners an easement for water access. What he failed to do," Marcus said, tapping a specific page, "was secure a legal severance and transfer of the primary water rights from the parent parcel. Those rights, dating back to a claim filed in 1947, remained with the original ranch. The ranch that my client, Mr. Protagonist's name, now owns in its entirety." He let that sink in. The room was utterly silent. You could see the gears turning in everyone's heads. The HOA lawyer's face went pale. Brenda looked utterly confused, as if she couldn't comprehend what was being said. "To be perfectly clear," Marcus stated, looking directly at the board, then at Brenda, "for the last 15 years, the Crestview Estates HOA has been operating on a permissive, non-binding handshake agreement with the previous owner. They have been the beneficiaries of his goodwill. Legally, every gallon of water they have pumped from their community wells has been at the discretion of the owner of the senior water rights. That owner is now my client." He walked over and handed a copy of the deed analysis to the chairman and another to the HOA's stunned lawyer. The game had changed. "We weren't there to ask for permission to drill a well. We were there to inform the board of the true legal situation, a situation Brenda's own aggression had forced into the light." The board members were now looking at Brenda not as a concerned community leader, but as the representative of a group that had been using a resource they didn't own. Her position of moral authority had evaporated in an instant. She had gone from plaintiff to squatter. The smug smirk was long gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief. The trap had been sprung. Now it was time to close it. Chairman Henderson looked down at the documents Marcus had provided, then back up at the HOA's lawyer, who was frantically and silently flipping through the pages, his face ashen. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a contentious hearing to a public autopsy. The HOA's case wasn't just dead, it was being dissected for all to see. "Counselor," Henderson said to the HOA's lawyer, his voice dangerously low, "is what Mr. Davies alleges here accurate? Are you telling me your client's entire community is drawing water to which they hold no legal title?" The lawyer stammered, "Mr. Chairman, we would need time to review these documents. This is a complete surprise. It was a weak deflection, and everyone knew it. The evidence was right there in the county's own records." Marcus stepped forward again, his demeanor now one of magnanimous, if calculating, reason. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "my client has no desire to see his neighbors go without water. That would be unconscionable. He is not the aggressor here. He was forced into this position by the HOA's baseless and malicious legal action. However, he is a reasonable man. He is prepared to rectify the developer's 15-year-old mistake and provide the Crestview community with a permanent, legally secure water supply." He pulled a second, slimmer document from his briefcase. "To that end, we have drafted a new water supply and easement agreement. We are prepared to offer this agreement to the Crestview Estates HOA, to be signed today. It will grant them, in perpetuity, the legal right to draw water from the aquifer. It solidifies their water future, protecting all the family's Mrs. Brenda's last name was so concerned about." He handed copies to the board and to the HOA's lawyer. Brenda snatched the copy from her lawyer's hand and began reading it, her eyes darting across the page. "This agreement formalizes the relationship," Marcus continued. "It establishes a modest annual fee for residential households to contribute to the long-term management and protection of our shared resortia concept. I'm sure the HOA, as responsible stewards, will appreciate." He paused, then delivered the final, devastating blow. "The agreement also includes a fair use provision. It distinguishes between standard residential use and commercial-scale water consumption. Any commercial activities, such as watering vast pastures or sustaining livestock for commercial purposes, will naturally be metered and billed separately at standard market rates for agricultural water. This ensures that no single user disproportionately burdens the resource at the expense of the wider community." The room was silent, but the implication was a thunderclap. Every homeowner there understood immediately. The agreement would secure their water for a small, reasonable fee, but it would make Don and Brenda's Vanity cattle farm financially unviable overnight. The cost to continue watering their ornamental pasture and herd of longhorns at commercial rates would be astronomical. I watched Brenda's face as she read that specific clause. Her face, which had been pale with shock, flushed a deep, furious red. She understood. She knew she had been surgically targeted and neutralized. She looked up at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. She had started a war to stop my one little well, and in response, I had placed a legal and financial stranglehold on her entire lifestyle. Her own petition, her own arrogance, had led directly to this. It was a self-inflicted wound of epic proportions. The HOA lawyer, seeing the writing on the wall, quickly spoke to Don, who had turned a sickly shade of green. The other residents sitting behind them were now talking animatedly. They weren't looking at me as the villain anymore. They were looking at me as the person offering them a lifeline, a permanent solution to a problem they never even knew they had. And they were looking at Brenda as the person who had risked their entire community's water supply over a personal grudge. Her power was evaporating before our very eyes. "Mr. Chairman," the HOA's lawyer said, his voice now stripped of all its earlier bravado, "given these developments, the Crestview Estates HOA formally withdraws its petition against Mr. Protagonist's name." Henderson nodded grimly. "Petition withdrawn. And I would strongly advise you and your clients to seriously consider the generous offer Mr. Davies has put on the table." The hearing was over. As people started filing out, several of the Crestview residents approached me, not with hostility, but with questions. One man shook my hand. "So, we really don't own our water?" he asked. Not technically, no, I replied calmly. But this new agreement will fix that for you. For good. They looked relieved. They understood they had dodged a bullet they never saw coming. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Brenda. A special HOA meeting was called the following week. Faced with the reality that their president's personal vendetta had nearly led to a catastrophe and had exposed them all to a massive legal vulnerability, the homeowners voted overwhelmingly to remove her from the board. Her reign was over. Stripped of her power and facing crippling water bills, she and Don had no choice. Within a month, a livestock trailer was parked in their driveway. They sold off their entire herd of boutique longhorns. The lush green pasture they had watered so extravagantly slowly turned brown and yellow under the summer sun. A few months later, a "for sale" sign went up in their front yard. I heard from Earl that they sold the house at a loss and moved to a condo in the city. The last time I saw Brenda, she was driving her white Lexus out of the Crestview gates for the final time. She saw me checking my fence line on my ATV and just stared straight ahead, a bitter, defeated woman who had flown too close to the sun on wings of pure entitlement. The new HOA board, a group of much more reasonable people, eagerly signed the water agreement. Our relationship is now professional and respectful. They pay their annual fee, I ensure the resource is well managed, and everyone has peace of mind. I got my agricultural well, and my ranch is thriving. Life is quiet and good. Sometimes, when I'm out on the pasture watching my own small herd of cattle graze, I think about Brenda. I think about how she tried to use the power of rules and regulations as a weapon. She just forgot the most important rule of all. Before you start a war, you'd better be sure you know who actually owns the battlefield. In this case, she thought it was the little patch of grass in her backyard. It turned out to be the entire world beneath her feet.